Welcome back to the History of Early Western Civilization. This is Professor Allen, and here is Lecture Day 20. So this lecture is going to cover several major topics. First, it will be the Five Good Emperors. After that, it will be the Barracks Emperors, followed by the Crisis of the Third Century. After that, we'll end up talking about Emperor Diocletian and his reign, and then when he decides to step down, a little bit of a issue ends up coming up with who gets to take over after him. And so, or who decides to start taking over after him, rather. And so it's kind of a roller coaster of a ride, with it going up during this period, and then going down, and then still down, and then it goes back up for a bit, and then starts going down again as we lead into next lecture. And so let's go ahead and start with the Five Good Emperors. Well, the Five Good Emperors were this series of five emperors, one after another, okay, ruling from the year 96 CE, or current era, to 180 CE. So that's about 84 years or so, okay? So that's a pretty good span for these five emperors to rule, as well as what they ended up doing during this period. And of course, these five good emperors are nicknamed that today by historians. Obviously, they probably weren't called the five good emperors back then. Maybe later on in the Roman Empire, but definitely by us historians, that's who calls them that. Interestingly, each of them chose the next person to rule by adoption and for that heir's merit, okay? And we'll talk a little bit about that, as in they were always chosen to basically rule next for their leadership capabilities and stuff, as opposed to being related necessarily to them. Until the last of the five good emperors, he chooses someone else. So let's go ahead and get started with the first one of these five, and that is Nerva, okay? And if you recall, Nerva we spoke about very briefly last time in Lecture 19, that he was an advisor to the Emperor Domitian of the Flavian dynasty, okay, of the Flavian dynasty. Nerva was elderly, okay, an advisor. He was an old man at the time. He lived from the year 30 to 98, okay, and in 96 CE, he ends up helping plot the assassination of Domitian, okay? He and the Praetorian Guard, Domitian's own wife, and several advisors, including Nerva, all decide, as well as the Senate, kind of decide to, kill Domitian. Let's get rid of him. He's crazy. And he's bankrupting the empire. And so, they decide to do that. Nerva, of course, wasn't the person that stabbed him or anything, but after Domitian is dead, everyone basically looks at Nerva and say, you're the most qualified person to rule. We know that you're not going to be crazy like Domitian was or anything, or power hungry. Please take over. And so that ends up what happening. So he actually rules as emperor from the year 96 CE until 98 CE. Only 16 months. He was very old at the time, 30. He was born in 30 and he lived up to 98. So he was 68, which is pretty old for back then. Okay, pretty old for back then. Really, really old for back then. And so he was also known as the caretaker emperor, because he kind of was taking care of the empire as it was kind of rebuilding and fixing itself after Domitian. And remember, right before Domitian was, of course, his older brother Titus, Domitian's brother Titus, who had a bunch of natural disasters such as plague, a fire in Rome, and also the volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius in Italy. And so there were constant disasters, and the plague was throughout the entire empire. Okay, really big plague. And so killing thousands upon thousands of people. And so really, the empire really needed someone to start picking up the pieces after all of that crisis when Titus died, and Domitian was who came next, and that wasn't really good to do that. And so, really, when Nerva comes in, he's really taking care of the empire to rebuild it and make it strong again. He also continues many of the building projects that the Flavian dynasty had begun. Many of the building projects, such as some of the very large temples or libraries or other buildings, roads, new road systems, possibly different things such as the aqueducts and stuff like that also. Maybe some hippodromes and stuff throughout the empire that Domitian and Titus had previously begun, or even their father Vespasian had begun beforehand, if they took decades to build, right? And so that's what he ends up doing. Rather than creating any of his own new projects, he just finishes up what had already been started. He focused on politics and fixing things compared to focusing on the army. Domitian focused on the army a lot and gave them tons and tons of raises. And Nerva is like, yeah, no, that's not going to continue. We're not going to keep on giving you a bonus every year without you doing something to earn it. And we really can't afford to do that anyway. And so the army really disliked Nerva, but at this point, he was emperor, and the Senate and others backed him, and so the army really didn't do anything, especially, also, he only ruled for 16 months, so there was probably no time for them to do anything. He had no children of his own that had kind of really lasted to adulthood at this point, and so he had no heirs, and instead of deciding, let's pick another political person, he decides to pick a man named Trajan. Okay, a man named Trajan, who was originally from Spain and actually a military commander. And the reason why he decides to choose Trajan and adopts Trajan, Trajan actually gets a letter in the mail saying, hey, you've been adopted by the emperor. And Trajan was chosen because of his closeness and his military leadership abilities, and as well as just being a military leader himself. And so, because Nerva wanted to repair the fracture between himself and the army some way, so he's like, look, your next emperor is going to be one of you guys, one of your army guys and army leaders. And so that kind of helped things, and so he wanted to make sure that that was who was going to take over after him, because he realized the army was getting kind of restless over the 16 months, and because they had been accustomed to so much of stuff from Domitian, but that wasn't able to be afforded under Nerva. Nerva ends up dying of a sweating sickness. Okay, he dies of a sweating sickness. We're not exactly sure specifically what sickness it could be. It could have been multiple different ones, like some sort of fever, obviously, but it was probably maybe something like, I don't know, maybe malaria or something. But different things can give sweating sickness as kind of like the major symptom of sweating before you die. And so obviously at 68, his body wasn't cut out to survive it, and so he ended up dying. On his death, there is said to have been a solar eclipse throughout the empire, over the empire, or at least visible from Rome. And so the people of the Roman Empire kind of took this as the gods are being sad that Emperor Nerva died. And so, obviously, the Romans were very, very close and religious people, and so when they see the solar eclipse and they find out that Nerva died, they're like, oh, the gods themselves are sad, right? Moving on, let's talk a little bit about Trajan. He lived from 53 to 117 CE, and he was emperor from 98 to 117. He again was from Spain, okay, right here, in Spain, Hispania. And again, he got a letter telling him that he was Nerva's heir. Okay, and it's like, thanks, was probably his kind of response. And he was again chosen because he was a military leader. Okay, he was very masculine and had habits of very masculine habits, such as he used to brag about climbing mountains in Spain all the time and climbing up all the hills and different things, and going hiking constantly and camping and stuff, even when he was younger. And now that he's in the military, he's definitely very masculine with that. He's a good fighter and stuff like and all. However, he did have a bit of a perverted kind of sense. He was very attracted to young boys, so he was obviously a pedophile towards young boys. He eventually decided to adopt his second cousin, a man named Hadrian. Okay, so that Trajan realized that one day he'll die, obviously, and so he decides to adopt his second cousin, Hadrian, because he knew Hadrian would rule well after him. Okay? Trajan ends up expanding the empire into the area of Dacia, okay? Dacia right here. which are against the Dacians. The Dacians are people with very large swords called the Falx, F-A-L-X, F-A-L-X, the Falx. It was kind of this big two-handed sword that could basically cleave through the shield and the armor, as well as the Roman soldier wearing it and wielding the shield, all in one go. And so they were very dangerous people, these Dacians. And so he is able to actually conquer the area of Dacia right here. And he did 2 campaigns against the Dacians in 101 to 102, and then again in 105. Okay. He also went in and attacked Mesopotamia, and actually conquered Mesopotamia here, as well as this little area, as well as this area. And who did he fight? Parthia. Yeah, he went to war against Parthia, and he actually led it. He actually went himself, because again, he's a military guy, and so he went to Dacia himself and led the armies, and then when he went to Mesopotamia in 115 to 117 CE, he was again leading the armies himself. He had other generals and legion commanders under him, but he, of course, was doing a lot of it himself. And so this is a map of the empire under Trajan in 116. You can kind of see Egypt and North Africa, a good part of Europe. Now he's added Dacia. Now he's added Parthia. And then he's, of course, got Britain up to this little red line here. And so he defeated Parthia, and while on campaign against Parthia, right before he actually finished them off, he ends up dying of a stroke. Okay, a stroke. He obviously didn't realize this was going to happen. He wasn't killed by someone or assassinated. He actually died of a stroke. But his armies are able to finish off the job against Parthia and conquer it fully. During his reign, they actually built Trajan's Column. Trajan's Column was this big giant column or statue, as you can see right here. It's very detailed right there. It is 98 feet high, with an additional 27 feet up here. Down here, the pedestal. The pedestal is an extra 27 feet high right here. And so that's the door, and you can actually go inside it and climb up to the top of it up here. But this little pedestal area right here, this little box it stands on the pedestal, is 27 feet high, and from this part here all the way to the top is 98 feet high on that zone. And so the column's width, the column itself width is 12 feet in diameter, It's a very big sculpture, and it commemorates his Dacian campaign. And if you look closely, it shows like military soldiers and stuff planning, and they've got goats and animals and other things. They've got their ships, they've got their fighting here against the Dacians, and all sorts of things. And if you look up it's this one story wrapping around all the way to the top about the Dacian campaign that he went on. And so it was built in the years sometime after 105 CE, give or take, And so it is known as Trajan's Column, and it obviously stands today in Rome, Moving on, you can kind of see again how much he was able to add right here, this and this area here, Dacia here, is where he added kind of along this coast. And so he's added quite a good bit here, this part here. Armenia was kind of already conquered, but Mesopotamia here. Parthia kind of retreated. They weren't completely finished off, but for the most part, Parthia was finished at this phase thanks to Trajan. And so let's move on to Hadrian. After Trajan died of a stroke, Hadrian came to power because he had been adopted. Hadrian is a very interesting figure because he was Spanish, but we think he was actually born in Rome, and that his family moved to Rome when he was a child. And so he took over as emperor after he found out that Trajan had died of natural causes through that stroke, and so he ended up taking over. He ended up actually not being very well liked by many of the Senate, because he immediately, once he takes over, he goes to Rome very quickly, and then he ends up saying, I'm emperor, talks to the Senate very briefly, and then packs his bags and takes troops with him as well, or the Praetorian Guard, or some of the Praetorian Guard with him, and ends up traveling the entire empire. He travels the entire empire. He goes to almost every single province. Okay, and there's a difference here as in this map. I'll quickly say it quickly. The pink provinces here are senatorial provinces, which means they have elected senators, and the other green provinces don't have senatorial representation. Okay, they don't have senatorial representation. They are just still part of the empire, though. Okay, so they're kind of unfairly treated, I guess. Moving on, let's talk a little bit about this touring of the empire. When he goes on touring the empire, a lot of people kind of nickname him the Restless Emperor, and historians definitely nickname him that today, is because he couldn't stay still. You know, being restless is you can't stay still or can't sit still. Well, obviously, he goes around the entire empire, which is a huge amount of territory to cover. And he, of course, lived from 76 to 138, and he reigned from 117 to 138. So about 21 years. And for 21 years, he was kind of constantly traveling the empire. And during this period of time, the Senate kind of feel like, well, if he's not going to rule us, we might as well plot against him, take over, and nominate one of our own guys to be as the emperor. And so there's a senatorial plot against him as he starts touring the empire, or is continuously touring the empire. And eventually that senatorial assassination plot isn't successful. They are not able to successfully kill Hadrian because as they are planning it, some of Hadrian's spies or the Praetorian Guard find out about it, or some of Hadrian's allies, and so those senators are actually executed. The senators involved are executed, and so no plot actually is ever carried out. He ends up actually pulling Roman forces out of Mesopotamia because he starts realizing that some of the Parthian Empire kind of is still fighting. Some other areas here are fighting against him, and it's just, he's overextended. He's realized he's overextended into Mesopotamia and all, and let's pull back to a more able to be guarded border. And so he pulls back out of Mesopotamia, pulls the legions out of Mesopotamia and the east, basically in general, this whole area. And so kind of pulls back to Syria and Asia Minor. And because of that, he basically is giving up those provinces back to Parthia and other places out there and other kingdoms out there. And so, however, he does keep them in part of Parthia. He pulls out of most of area of Parthia, but he keeps them in part of Parthia because there are gold mines there. Okay, he realizes, we should probably keep those territories where the gold mines are. And so some of this area is pulled out of, or at least Mesopotamia itself, the Fertile Crescent part of Mesopotamia here. But he keeps along this area. He kind of pulls out of here, and he kind of pulls out of some of Armenia back to these areas. But these areas he keeps because they've got gold. And so it's very interesting that he pulls somewhat out of Parthia and somewhat not, okay? But because of gold. He also has to end up kind of pulling that out of that area and pulling them back into Syria and Jerusalem because there's a second Jewish revolt there. Another major revolt by the Jewish people happens in Syria and Jerusalem, and so his forces in that area are basically transferred to hold the border and also fight down here in Jerusalem. Okay. And he, of course, is able to conquer it. He loved Greek culture when he ended up going to Greece and studying them. He started actually deciding to grow a beard during his emperorship, or had already previously had one. We've got statues of him with a beard. We also know that he went all the way north to Britain, okay, up to Britain, which had been already conquered. However, there were constant raids from the people up here in this part of Britain called the Celts. The Celts. They lived up in here, Scotland, basically. Present-day Scotland. Okay? And these people were known as the Celts. They were kind of the barbarians and people that had lived in Britain beforehand. And so they start fighting against the Romans that live in Britain. And so Hadrian decides in 122 CE to order a wall to be built across the entire expanse of Britain right here. An entire wall from sea to sea. All the way from the North Sea out to the Irish Sea, basically, here. And so from one side side of the British Isle to the other. Okay, and so let's talk a little bit about Hadrian's Wall. And so this is what it would look like from the side. Here would be the wall itself. There would be a big ditch, and they would actually build it up a little bit so it was even deeper, and the regular land would be all this way, okay? And so this would be the north. This would be on this side of, of Hadrian's Wall, Scotland, okay? And the Romans would be on this side. This would be the south. And so the wall would be here, and troops would walk along it here. There would be a military road, which of course is built up so it wouldn't wash away from erosion. There would be an extra little hillock or northern mound here with another trench here, and then another mound here, so that if the Romans had to, they could get away from the wall. If for some reason it was overrun, they could run all the way back to here and defend this here, and so the enemies would have to climb over this, go down here, and climb up this while getting attacked, and shot at by bows and arrows, their pilum, spears, etc. Okay, and so Hadrian's Wall was begun in the year 122 CE. It is 80 miles, Roman miles that is, which is 80 Roman miles from here to here, across, which equals 73 modern miles. The Roman mile was slightly shorter than ours, okay? There had 25,000 Roman soldiers to protect it, okay? And it was built to keep the Celts out of Roman-controlled Britain. And so I've got some actual pictures of Hadrian's Wall. So this is actually Hadrian's Wall right here. Today, you can see it's kind of small compared to these people here because it's collapsed, okay? This is what's left of it today. Almost 2,000 years later, or, 1,900 years later. And so it's kind of small now today, but you can kind of get the feel of where it was. And they built it over hills and everything. They just built it across. This is what part of it looks like today as well. I've actually seen this portion, but my photo of it that I took myself actually is very, very blurry, and you can't tell what the heck's going on. But you can see how big it is. These are small children at the top of it, or children at the top of it. So you can kind of see how big it is, how big the wall is, and how thick it is. And it would have been like this the entire way across. Here's a gatehouse of it. And you can again see how big it is with a big gate. And of course, yes, there would have been doors so that the troops could actually go north of the wall to go and explore and fight against the Celts if the Celts were coming, or at least scout out to see if they were coming. This is that little kind of trench right before it, or right that little hill before it goes gets down into a ditch. And of course, you can kind of see the ditch, but most of it is filled in because of erosion over the years. And so, obviously, you can see this right here, which I'm going back to this slide because this would have been a little military camp here, which is very similar to this. So the wall itself would have been over here, and then they would have had small little forts with that big gatehouse here. Okay, or smaller versions of the gatehouse here. Okay, and they would have had maybe troops living in this right here. And so here's a built-up bigger version where the wall's extending that way, obviously, and the wall goes off this way. And so on this side, it's the Roman side, and on this side, it's the Celts side. Okay, and so they've got a big kind of castle structure with multiple buildings for the military to live in, and then their families or shops and other village buildings would be out here on this side, on the defended southern side. Okay, and so it's kind of that's a model, obviously. And so the Romans obviously defended the wall very well, okay, for a long time. And in fact, in the southern part of Britain, this portion here, you can actually see this area. These are all areas that Roman coins have been found in Britain today, not just dating from Hadrian's reign, but also later on. And so lots and lots of Roman coins have been found, meaning that the Roman currency was commonly used throughout the whole empire and Britain, right? And as well as just how much people from the Romans got around throughout all of Britain. They colonized all of Britain, and then obviously the wall is right around here, and so this portion here. You can kind of see the wall again right here, and the extent of the empire under Hadrian right here. Okay, and he kind of pulled out of this area again, and he pulled back to this area. And so let's talk about Antoninus Pius, the fourth of the five good emperors very quickly. And so Antoninus Pius was adopted by Hadrian, again, not blood-related. He lived from 86 CE to 161 CE. He was emperor from 138 when Hadrian died of natural causes. And he took over and lasted until 161. So about 30 years, almost 30 years, closer to 20. And so he was normally and socially minded. He understood things going on in the Roman world. He understood very well about all the plights that the poor had, and so he ended up setting up something for children that were orphans. Okay, so we actually set up actual orphanages. Beforehand, they had kind of had ideas of orphanages, but not too much. You were just kind of left out on the streets and usually became a slave or something like that, or had to fend for yourself. But now he's actually setting up actual orphanages throughout the entire empire for orphaned children, especially those that were orphaned because of, their parents dying from some sort of war or something on the borders. And interestingly, he also set up a trust fund, a trust fund where people could donate to it, as well as just also have an amount of money from the empire's fortune put into it, and then it would kind of gain interest and stuff and gain more money for dowries of the girls that lived in these orphanages. So what's a dowry? Some of you might know this, some of you might not, and that's okay. I'll explain it. A dowry is this amount of money that you would gift your future husband or future husband's family, okay? And girls would do this, hoping to be wives, because they would hope that, yes, that man is going to maybe pick me, but only if I have a very good dowry, okay? That people didn't always get married for love or anything like that, especially during this period. And so people would have these dowries and end up doing that and have this money. Well, obviously these orphaned girls don't have a family to hand down their money to the girl to go give to a hopeful husband for the dowry, okay? And so who's going to want to marry these orphan girls? Probably no one, right? Unless they fell in love with them, and even then, you still usually need a dowry to give to your husband or husband's family to get married. And so this trust fund was actually set up by Antoninus Pius so that these girls that were orphans in these orphanages that he set up could actually have something to give to a young man's family to get married. Okay, these dowries. So it's quite an interesting feature that he set this up. He never ever visited Britain. He was too busy elsewhere in the Roman Empire. But he never ever visited Britain, but he ordered the construction of the Antonine Wall in the year 142. And so the Antonine Wall is this little wall here, as if we go back to the British wall. You've got Hadrian's Wall here, and so if we go to this map, Hadrian's Wall is here, the Antonine Wall is right here, the next little thin spot of Britain, because they're expanding out. Now, it was begun in 142 CE, and it took a few years to build. It wasn't all that great. Okay, it wasn't all that great. It was a stone foundation that they built stone along the bottom, and then the rest of the wall itself was just mud and grass piled on top of that mud so it wouldn't erode away. Basically like a big, kind of like a hill, okay? And kind of like you had seen in this image here, like this, but much bigger. Much bigger than just that, little slope right there. The Antonine Wall was, of course, 10 feet high, that little mud bank, kind of like a levee, okay? We know what levees are around here. So, kind of like a levee. It was 39 miles wide, because it was a very thin area right here. And it had 16 small forts along it to have troops along it. However, it doesn't really last, and eventually it gets overrun in the next couple emperors, and they end up having to run away. The Roman troops run back to Hadrian's Wall, and they push back, the Roman soldiers push the Celts back up across the Antonine Wall over the next few decades. Antoninus Pius doesn't actually have a son himself. He has a daughter, though, and his daughter ends up marrying this politician and very good prominent Roman named Marcus Aurelius. Okay, Marcus Aurelius was this patrician and very important Roman at the time, and Antoninus Pius sees something in the young Marcus Aurelius and decides, you know what? I like this guy. I want this guy to be in charge after me. And so he adopts Marcus Aurelius to be his next heir. I mean, he's already married to his daughter, or Marcus Aurelius is already married to Antoninus Pius's daughter, so it makes sense. Antoninus Pius lives to 74 years old and then dies of peaceful natural causes. And Marcus Aurelius obviously takes over, and we will talk about him, the last and final of the 5 good emperors, or the 5th good emperor, in the next video.